They arrested him on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and old newspapers. One of those thin, gray days Boston, where it's like a coat it never quite takes off. The city hummed with its usual indifferent noise. Buses sighing, construction jackhammers, a dog walker cursing at an overexcited Labrador. But in a small brick building on a quiet side street, where the echoes of footsteps tend to stay, the air went still. Someone in the squad room muttered a name that moved through the city like a pulse. Florence Gibson. Before we continue, take a second to hit that subscribe button and like the video. Your support helps us grow. Let me know in the comments below where you are watching from. For 27 years, Florence had been a photograph in a drawer for her parents, a faded name on the lips of her students, a plaque in a lecture hall no one liked to look at. She was the college teacher who loved books the way most people love air, vital obvious, stolen. She liked strong coffee at dawn, the smell of rain on concrete, and she kept a jar of pencils on her desk organized by height. People who had known her said she listened like someone was rare. She celebrated small victories like a parade. She had been 32 the day she died in 1988, and when the detectives closed her file then, they had done so with a hollow certainty. Someone had taken her from the world and left the rest of them to do the living. Now the file was being opened again. The man with cuffs at his wrists, whose face for a few hours would be a television face and a whispered name in bars, had a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore a gray hoodie and the kind of nonchalance people use as armor. His name would not be the end of the story. Not yet. The arrest was only beginning of truth, of reckoning, of the way a town learns to wear its shame. You need to understand Florence to understand why the city shut down when they said her name. She taught American literature at a downtown college that smelled of dust and ambition. Her students adored her not because she was glamorous, she wasn't, but because she was sharp enough to cut away pretense. She urged them to read novels the way one might read a person, with patience and suspicion and a readiness to be surprised. She had a laugh that sounded like a bell in a church no one used. She rode the T every morning at 7:12, folding her scarf with a neat motion. And by 7:19 she was at the coffee cart, nodding to the same vendors she'd known for years. She taught freshman composition and graduate seminars, and she graded essays with red ink the way a sculptor chips at marble. That winter in 1988 had been especially cruel. The city had been full of people moving fast, trying to outrun the way the streets closed in. Florence left campus one Thursday evening after a faculty meeting about budget cuts and curricula, carrying a stack of students' essays and a leather satchel. She never made it home. Her body was found in an alley behind a row of shuttered warehouses 3 days later, discovered by a municipal worker who thought at first it was a mannequin. The coroner's report was clinical and cold. The police had a handful of clues, a tire track, an anonymous tip, a cigarette, but nothing that nodded into a person. The case went cold when the trail ran out and the city turned its back. For the families left behind, cold becomes a slow-burning furnace. Florence's mother, Helen, kept her daughter's sweater folded in an oak chest like one keeps holy things. Her father, Arthur, who had been a machinist all his life, started to write letters he never sent to the mayor, to the chief of police, to the faceless murmur of justice, asking why she had been left to vanish. Her students branded her absence into their own calendars. Anniversaries, milestones, weddings where someone would glance at a seat or a room and think of Florence. The college named a small reading room after her, bare bones, a plaque, a bouquet that turned to dust. People lit candles. People forgot. That is how time folds. It remembers, but not the same thing every year. In the years that followed, rumors grew like mold in the corners of bars and faculty lounges. Someone swore they saw her at a lecture in Cambridge. Someone else swore a man in a bar had bragged about it. There were angry letters to the paper, petitions that led nowhere, and whispered conspiracies about the university's role in silencing scandal. Each theory was a kind of prayer. None of them took. Then, decades later, the county cold case unit began to reopen files. It was not heroism so much as stubbornness and new technology. The promise that DNA could speak where memory could not. Forensic genealogy, the detectives called it, a mapping of old traces into modern trees. Some investigators considered it a miracle and others a knife. Family members called it a last chance. Detective Clara Moreno headed the team the morning the lab called. She was not the kind of detective who liked flash. Her face held the long patience of someone who had seen many ends and still woke up to try again. She remembered reading Florence's file as a young detective, imagining the woman behind the words. With time, that imagination hardened into resolve. The county's lab had been running tests, blood spatter, fibers, anything that might link the scene to a name. They had never expected a match to a living person. Clara leaned over the phone like it was a child giving confession. "You sure?" she asked. The lab tech's voice was small and certain. "S&P match," he said. "Close enough for a warrant." Clara felt the world tilt toward the place where the fresh wound of the old case still hurt. She pulled up photographs of Florence, 24 images scanned into PDFs, notes in looping handwriting from officers who had long since retired. She drove to the precinct and breathed in coffee and photocopy toner. Arrest warrants don't erase grief, but they change the rhythm of a town. The man arrested that day, Walter Quinn, had been a small name in Florence's orbit in 1988. He'd been a graduate student once, quiet, always at the edge of lectures, quick with a correction on a footnote. People remembered him as polite, a little too eager to help carry boxes of books after faculty meetings. He had left town not long after the murder and had lived for years in a suburb where the houses looked like dominoes. He worked at a shipping company, someone who handled other people's possessions the way he'd handled his own life, carefully, with a certain distance. Nobody suspected him, not really. That is the thing about predators who hide among the ordinary. They fold into the city's breathing. When the officers brought him in, someone in Florence's family recognized the jawline from an old photograph. There was no dramatic chase, no confession on the cusp of the precinct steps. Walter had been pulled from his car and read his rights like a page out of the script. The city devoured those few simple facts. "Arrest in cold case" became the headline in a paper that had once printed her obituaries alongside the daily stock reports. The news cameras found the house where he had lived in the 80s and filmed it like it was a crime scene diorama. The same mail slot, the same ivy climbing a red brick wall. The interrogation room was a rectangle built to be small and honest. Clara watched from the observation booth as Walter sat like a man squinting into a long memory. He refused to speak without his lawyer. The legal dance is both cathedral and theater. Inside, she thought of Florence's students, of the man who had taught a class in which someone had left a bouquet of daisies in the back row. She thought of Helen and Arthur, who had grown thin with grief. "We didn't have closure," Helen told Clara later, her hands folded like a prayer that had been held too long. What pushed the case forward was the stubbornness of science and the care of a young lab technician who had refused to let a sample die. There had been a smear, small, almost invisible, on the back of Florence's satchel. The technology of 1988 couldn't coax a result out of it. But in an era where someone can map a single hair to a family tree, the smear found its way into a database like a ghost reaching for a hand. Forensic genealogy cross-referenced DNA markers and family trees and built a ladder of relations until the detectives found a branch that led to Walter's family name. It wasn't a direct hit at first. It was a possibility. Possibility means warrants, and warrants mean people who once lived in the same neighborhood get calls at dawn. Walter's relatives were polite and confused. He was always a private man. His sister told a reporter with eyes that tried and failed to hold back a tremor. He didn't have many friends, but he was kind to us. I can't imagine. She stopped. Images of normal lives do not like to be disrupted by violence. The town tried to hold both narratives. He was the man they'd known, and the man the state accused. The first trial was not the thing that finally made people speak. Trials are for evidence. They do not necessarily unspool memory. What changed the town was the night Walter was arraigned and asked, quietly, almost accidentally, questions about a red scarf and a lecture hall. He lifted his chin and smiled like a man looking at a familiar line in a text. He claimed he had been in the city that night. Yes, but he said he had been at a bar. His alibi was thin. Then there was the bus ticket found in a jacket he no longer owned, a photograph taken at a holiday party where in the background he stands a little too close to Florence in a group shot. Evidence, like water, finds the path out of stone. The family felt the tide turn. For Helen, at 70-something, each new paragraph in the narrative reopened an old ache and closed a small door. She went to the arraignment, clutching a program from the college's memorial. The sight of Walter in an orange jumpsuit made her knees tremble. "I didn't want to see him," she whispered afterward to Clara, "but I needed to." She wanted to see for herself whether the man the law had knotted in evidence was the one who had taken her daughter. Seeing him didn't translate into relief. It translated into a complicated exchange. There was a person in their life, a story of a brother and neighbor. And yet, the thing the detectives were promising to give her, answers, watched through a keyhole and said, "Not yet." Not everyone wanted to watch. Some of Florence's former students avoided the news, like one avoids a room where a lamp has been left on because it reminds them of the way a life had been cut. Others returned to the lecture hall to sit in the second row, as if proximity could reawaken a voice. People lit candles at the small reading room, and a young woman named Maria, once one of Florence's students and now herself a teacher, stood and read one of Florence's essays aloud in a voice that trembled with reputation. The essay was about mercy, about how small gestures change the contours of people's days. "She taught me the language of being human," Maria said into a microphone that caught her voice and released it into a room that felt very, very old. When cases like this open, the town discovers other things about itself. People who had been silent find their tongues. A retired janitor remembered sweeping the alley the week Florence disappeared. A barista recalled an argument at closing time. The city that had shrugged and moved on now started to file testimony like leaves onto a riverbank. Each account was a small correction to the map. But the arrest also forced people to ask harder questions. How could a man have moved through the same places as Florence, sat in the same seminars, perhaps nodded at the same jokes, and kept such a secret? How is it possible for ordinary lives to hide extraordinary crimes? Those are the questions that make the community rearrange itself. Like furniture after a flood, the courtroom became a place of quiet intensity. Prosecutors presented the facts methodically. A tire mark that matched a vehicle tied to Walter, fiber analysis. The testimony of a now elderly co-worker who remembered Walter's anxiousness about a complicated evening in 1988. The defense tried to explain away timing and coincidence, to paint a picture of a man whose life had been mundane and unremarkable. The jurors looked like people holding a fragile instrument. Too young, too old, each carrying their own invisible burdens. They listened to the prosecution call witnesses who had been children in 1988, now grown. They listened to forensic experts describe the miracle of DNA and its limits. Florence's parents came every day. They sat like two statues, not quite statues, breathing, blinking, wearing grief the way someone wears a uniform. When one witness described the alley the way it had felt, wet, cold, a place where shadows stacked, Helen breathed out a sound like wind through thin panes of glass. People who had never entered the courthouse before came to stand outside and hold vigil. The city's grief knit together with the legal process until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. But the truth, if truth exists as one unbroken thing in these tangled places, returned in fragments. The jury took weeks to deliberate because this case thrummed with the sound of time itself. They came back one afternoon with faces like travelers returning to a small town, different, weary, carrying a verdict, guilty. The word landed in the courtroom like a dropped coin, reverberating in the chest. For a moment, everyone forgot how to breathe. Guilty meant many things. It meant there would be an official recount and more testimony, an inevitable appeal. Guilty meant a name moved from rumor into record. It meant that for Helen and Arthur and dozens of students, a portion of the past had been recognized. It did not, of course, stitch Florence back into the world. It did not rearrange the years or fill the empty chairs. But it did ask the city to reckon with the space between remembering and justice. The aftermath was not simple solace. People who had once said it was time to forget now found themselves arguing about the public good of reopening wounds. Some questioned the methods that had brought the man to trial. Privacy advocates who thought forensic genealogy dangerous. Families who worried about the way science reaches into family trees like a curious stranger. There were articles and op-eds and a late-night host who joked about how the past eventually receives a subscription bill. Yet under all the noise, there simmered a quieter thing, relief rooted in recognition. Florence's colleagues struggled with a new burden: how to teach without the one who had modeled what it meant to teach well. They formed scholarships in her name and redesigned curriculum to include a lecture series on reporting violence and trauma sensitively. Students wrote papers about Florence as if writing could conjure her back. Some of the essays were tender, terrible, and true. The college installed a small plaque in the reading room, not as a monument, but as a question. How will we remember? Anyone who entered the room was asked to add a note. But even as the city breathed with an almost shy peace, a shadow of something else remained. Court records showed an anonymous letter one sent to campus security in 1989, too late for the case, containing a rumor that implicated another name, someone with different ties to Florence. The letter had been dismissed at the time as the bitter work of gossip. Now it resurfaced. It arrived like an old echo. Clara found herself drawn to that old letter, like someone reading a book and noticing a small footnote they had missed the first time. It was typed on a dot matrix printer, the letters slightly uneven, like an old rhythm of a different era. The note said in a clipped voice that some people had seen Florence leave with a man wearing a blue jacket the night she died. It mentioned an address that did not match Walter's. The detectives had never followed it up. They had been busy with leads that seemed more urgent. Now, years later, with a conviction and a city that felt both lighter and heavier, Clara wondered whether the letter had been a stray thread or part of a larger tapestry. She walked the alleys with a flashlight, retraced routes, and spoke to people whose names had not yet made it to the papers. She found a bartender who remembered a blue jacket and the way someone brought a woman a coffee too late and an apology that didn't land. She found a retired campus security officer who admitted, with a sigh, that they had been young and overwhelmed and had let things slide. Memory is an unreliable witness. But when multiple unreliable witnesses begin to tell the same story, patterns appear. And then a student, one who had been in Florence's class the semester before she died, came forward with a small notebook. In it were notes he'd taken of conversations, fragments of dates, a doodle, observations he had never thought to keep. In a margin, written in a shaky hand, was a line he'd copied from a poem Florence loved. "We are stitched together by what is taken from us." He had kept the notebook like a relic. He brought it to the county office with hands that trembled. Clara read it and felt the hair on her arms stand up. The notebook mentioned someone else who had been in the lecture hall that night, someone with a different name, someone whose alibi was thinner in a different kind of way. The detectives had to face an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the past was not a single line but a braided rope, and someone else had been holding another strand. Maybe Walter had been a part of something, but not the whole. Maybe the town had more to answer for. These possibilities did not diminish the conviction, but they complicated the story the city had told itself. People wanted a neat ending, a lockbox. Life rarely offers neat endings. What it offers is layers. Florence's death had been a blade that cut through many lives. The arrest closed one wound and opened another question about how many slivers there were and who else had been involved. The last scene in the courtroom felt less like a period and more like an ellipsis. Florence's father, Arthur, spoke at the sentencing. His voice was fragile and bright like a match. "She taught me to believe in the power of words," he said. "I hope these words bring something of her back." He looked at Walter and then at the jurors and then at the courtroom, as if placing final pieces in order. He asked for justice, but he also asked for something softer. For the town to remember Florence as she had been a teacher, a friend, someone who loved coffee before dawn, and not simply as a case file. When they transported Walter from the courthouse, the cameras followed, hungry for an image that resolved into a simple tale. Villain, punished. But Clara couldn't let the story be a single note. She thought of the anonymous letter in the notebook and the way evidence is never just science. It is rumor, memory, mistake, courage, and the slow, stubborn insistence of those who will not let a name die quietly. The arrest had shocked the town, yes, but the town itself needed to be shocked into looking at how easily one of its own could become a ghost, and how many people had the power to bring the ghost back. On the humid evening after the sentencing, a small group gathered in the reading room. They lit candles and read poetry aloud, including the poem Arthur had quoted. Maria read a passage from one of Florence's essays about listening to other people the way you listen to a weather report. Constantly, even when it is mundane. There were tears and a tentative laughter at a remembered joke. It was not catharsis, those are messy and brief, but it was a gathering of people acknowledging that their story, their grief, had been witnessed. Yet the story was not finished. As the room emptied, Clara lingered, reading her notes by the light of a single lamp. She had the conviction. She had the sense that the town's answer would not be complete without following the stray threads. She thought of little things, a bus ticket, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a dot matrix letter. She thought of how Florence had arranged her pencils by height, an almost compulsive orderliness that made the world a little neater. Then she thought of how the city itself had to be reordered. Outside, the rain started up again, soft and steady, filling the gutters with the sound of something cleaning itself. It was too neat to say that rain heals, but it does offer a kind of washing, a gentle insistence that even the smallest things are not beyond touch. As the street lights blinked awake, Clara stepped out and almost ran into an elderly woman standing by the lamppost. "You're Detective Moreno," the woman said, as if identifying a familiar sign. I knew Florence when she first came to teach. She once told me, she said, "Don't let what is terrible make you small." Clara swallowed. "We're trying not to," she said. The woman nodded, then handed her a sealed envelope. "I found this under a floorboard when I was fixing my kitchen last week," she said. "I thought it might belong to someone." The envelope was yellowed and the handwriting on it was old-fashioned. Clara felt the weight of it like a hand on her shoulder. "You might find it important," the woman added. Back at the precinct, Clara opened the envelope with hands that had seen too many things to be surprised, but which still reacted when the present offered bones of the past. Inside was a single photograph slightly curled at the edges, and a slip of paper with a time and a place scrawled on it. Pier 7, September 10th, 1988, 9:30 p.m. The photograph showed Florence laughing, arms around someone whose face was turned away just enough to be a silhouette. There was a blue jacket slung over a chair. Clara felt the old hunger of a case being reborn. A date, a place, a jacket. Walter's conviction had been a turning point, but this photograph, this tiny evidence, was a pry bar sliding into a seam the city thought sealed. The town had been shocked before. Now there was a new shock building, slow and inexorable. It wasn't meant to be a final blow. It was the sound of a lock turning very slowly. She set the photograph on the desk and dialed a number she had stored from years of work. The retired officer who had logged the anonymized tip. The man answered on the third ring. "I thought that case was closed," he said. Clara did not answer immediately. "No," she said finally. "Not yet." Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled of wet pavement and fried onions from a street vendor who had been too busy to notice the press cars. In the precinct, a window glowed with a lone lamp. When Clara placed a photograph under it, the picture seemed to change, revealing a detail that had eluded the usual light. A badge tucked into a pocket at the hip of the silhouetted man. The old detective cleared his throat on the phone. "You ever wonder how many people watched Florence slip away and decided it wasn't their story?" he asked. Clara looked at the photograph until the edges blurred. The arrest had shocked the town, yes, but it had also begun a reckoning with how towns choose their stories, whom they protect, and whom they let fall through the cracks. She thought of Helen and Arthur and Maria and the students who had kept notebooks like relics. She thought of Walter and his life and the quiet decisions that had led him to that fate. She thought of the blue jacket and the badge and the alley. There was work to be done. More interviews, more late nights, more paperwork. There would be appeals and more press and perhaps another trial. There would be a terrible, slow sifting of truths. But in the small reading room, someone had placed a fresh daisy beside Florence's plaque. It was absurdly hopeful. Helen had left it there that morning with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Clara stared at the photograph once more, then shut off the light. The door clicked behind her as she stepped into the night. Her phone buzzed with a message. "You okay?" It was from Maria. Clara typed back, "Not fast, not slow. We're close." And as she walked through the city that had held a secret for 27 years, she rehearsed the question she would ask the next witness, the next neighbor, the next reluctant man in a hoodie. "Do you remember that night?" The answer, she knew, might be thin and small and finally true. Florence's case had been solved in the way a lock is sometimes opened. One sudden movement, followed by the work of many hands. The arrest had shocked the town the way thunder shocks sleep, leaving everything glistening and raw. But the thunder was followed by a sound less dramatic and perhaps more important, the sound of people talking, of memories surfacing, of a city learning to keep watching its own shadow. And in a box at Clara's desk, beneath the photograph and the note, there was another envelope, a thin, unmarked thing she hadn't yet opened. It had been left in a stranger's hands, found under a floorboard in a kitchen, delivered by a woman who'd seen too many things to be surprised. Clara imagined Florence, smiling the way she did when she read a line that surprised her. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the strange small ways a life leaves traces, in pencil shavings and bus tickets, in poems copied in margins, in blue jackets tossed over chairs. She slit the envelope with a detective's knife and unfolded a single page. It was brief, barely more than a sentence, and as she read it she felt a cold settle along her spine. If you want the whole truth, look to the pier. The pier. Pier 7. September 10th, 1988. 9:30 p.m. Outside, the city exhales. Inside, the light is steady. The police scanner in Clara's pocket chittered like a nervous bird. She thought of the photograph and the daisy and the way justice, when it finally comes, is rarely neat. It arrives like the tide, slow, inevitable, and reveals what was hidden beneath the current. She shut off the lamp and stepped into the night with the photograph in her pocket and the unmarked envelope's direction on her tongue. There were more questions than answers now, and the town that had once slept uneasy had been roused to the point of wakefulness. The case that shocked the town had opened a door. On the other side of that door was the pier, cold board slick with memory, a blue jacket drying in a summer wind, and a man whose badge might have made him invisible to the very people who should have been watching. Clara walked toward the river, the city lights like a string of small truths. Somewhere ahead, under that fragile light, a new witness might be keeping silent, or an old truth might wait, patient as a stone. She thought of Florence's pencils arranged by height, and how in time some things can be put back in order, but not without work, not without asking the little inconvenient questions, not without going down to Pier 7 in the rain and waiting for someone to arrive. When Clara rounded the corner, she saw a figure on the far edge of the pier, a silhouette against the dark water. He turned slowly, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then the figure lifted his hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or warning. Clara's phone buzzed again. A message, "Don't go alone." She looked at the water, then at the man, then at the photograph in her pocket. The arrest had shocked the town, but the photograph and the note had made it clear. The story was not done. Someone else was waiting to be named. She took a breath and started walking toward the edge of the pier. The rain began again. At first a soft tapping that the river swallowed, then a steady sheet that made everything shine. The city behind her seemed to hold its breath. There was only the sound of water on wood, of a distant horn, the slow beating of her heart. Clara adjusted her jacket and kept walking. At the very end of the pier, where the boards whispered their oldest secrets, the man in the blue jacket turned his face toward her. For a moment the light caught him right in the eyes. Clara felt the slow, cold recognition that sometimes comes at the end of a long trail. "Detective Moreno," he said, as if greeting an old friend. She stopped 3 steps away. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Someone who knows," he said. When he started to speak, a car back on the shore slammed a door like a punctuation mark. The man on the pier took 1 step closer, and Clara saw, briefly, the glint of metal at his hip, a badge catching the harbor light. She inhaled, the rain salty in her mouth, and prepared to ask the question that would either close the last chapter or pull the city into a new one. "Do you remember that night?" she said. The man hesitated, and in that pause the pier seemed to tilt on time. He looked past her, at the water, and then back again. "I do," he said quietly, "but I remember it differently." Clara steadied herself for the answers. She did not know yet whether his words would open a wound or hand her the final piece, but she felt something settle in her gut like cold stone. Whatever came next, it would not be small. The rain intensified. The city behind them hummed with a life that was at once ordinary and impossibly fragile. The man in the blue jacket took a breath. "There's more to tell," he said. Clara put her hand in her pocket around the photograph and the note and the envelope. The arrest had shocked the town, but now, at the edge of the river, a new truth was about to be offered, or denied, or complicated, or made painfully, finally clear. She stepped forward into the rain, and the man began to speak. He held the photograph between two wet fingers and breathed as if the memory itself might burn him. The pier's boards creaked with old salt and new rain. The harbor dragged itself out beneath them like a slow animal. His jacket was damp and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something older, library dust and mothballs, and the faint tang of a life packed into boxes. He had the sort of face that showed time's kindness and cruelty at once. Many small lines, an expression learned over decades to be inscrutable. He folded his hands together and spoke as if unspooling a story he had practiced at night for years. "My name is Harold Brenner," he said. "How?" To the students who never called me Officer Brenner, and to people who only ever saw me standing by the main gate. I ran campus security in the 80s. I was supposed to make sure people got home. Instead, I learned how to make things disappear. Clara felt the name settle, like a stone dropped into still water. It was a small name on the roster of the city, the sort of name you noticed on a program and forgot by next day. But in his voice there was weight enough to bend the night. She had expected a confession, perhaps a flash of rancor, a last bitter sentence. She had not expected him to speak almost tenderly, as if he were naming a beloved object. "On September 10th, he said, Florence Gibson came to Pier 7 with evidence. She'd been careful, always careful. She brought a tape recorder and a list. She'd spent months gathering things she said would finish it. She said she was going to hand them to a reporter the next morning. She asked me to meet her because she wanted a witness. I was supposed to be a small, honest man who kept keys and lights in the university's bad consciences. That night I flinched." He paused and looked out over the water. Somewhere a gull called, a single ragged sound. "What was she going to finish?" Clara asked. "A ring," he said. "A ring of men. Donors, professors, administrators. People who thought the college was their children. They used students the way men in other towns used basements, quietly with rules, and with people who looked the other way." He swallowed. "She got names, letters, an address book. She had people on tape saying things that would have destroyed them. She thought the law would follow. She thought we would listen." Clara's pen hovered uselessly in her hand. The world had a way of gathering around those words, donors, professors, like moths to a lamp. She had always suspected institutions could be predators. Her job had required that suspicion. But to hear it articulated in the flat light of the pier felt like seeing a wound you had once bandaged finally opened. "What happened?" she asked. Hal laughed once, a sound without humor. "What happens when the people who run the town decide the town is more important than one life? They decide. They speak over you. They buy your silence with small comforts. They frame someone else because it is cheaper than destroying an institution." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, battered cassette tape. It was wrapped in an old plastic cover, the kind of thing that belonged to a different decade. He set it on the pier between them like an offering. "It took me 27 years to stop pretending I hadn't heard what I heard," he said. "I kept the tape because I thought someday the ground would open and the names would spill out. Someday I'd have the courage to hand it to the right person. Tonight I decided the town had been holding its breath long enough." Clara picked up the cassette and turned it over. On the label in faded ink was a single word, Florence. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I'm dying," Hal said, and the confession in that sentence bubbled up raw. "Because the years turned my bones to a thing I don't recognize, and because my son became all the things I swore I'd prevent. He became a man the town trusted. I protected him once. I cannot protect him twice with another man's life on my hands." The world narrowed to the small, trembling shape of Hal's hands. He was an ordinary human being with an ordinary son's face pressed into his memory. Inside the pier's wind, Clara heard the undertow of a different confessional. A father who had chosen his child over a stranger and had watched that choice calcify into decades of wrong. "My son," she said slowly. "Who?" Hal turned his face away, the harbor light tracing his profile like a half-remembered photograph. "Lawrence Brenner," he said. "Deputy Chief Lawrence Brenner. He retired early, moved upstate. Gave lots of speeches about community and safety. People think he is clean. They sold him medals for closing cases. God forgive me, he was there that night." Clara felt the air leave her. The name meant little to the public until it meant everything. A lawman, the son of the man standing on the pier, accepted by a community that counted on badges to be absolutions. The idea that such a man could be implicated in Florence's death made the harbor tremble, like a ship that had bumped something beneath the waves. Why would he? Clara asked. Why would he? Power, Al said. Because Florence had found how they bought girls with grades, with housing, with promises they could never keep. Because she had discovered they'd been using the same code for years. Because she would have been the voice those girls needed. Lawrence, God help him, panicked when he realized what exposing that ring would do. He'd seen the men who'd given him a career. He'd chosen them over justice. Hal's voice did not rise. There was something of a man confessing a petty theft, matter of fact, and yet full of a parent's horror. Clara imagined a boy in a neighbor's kitchen, small and eager to be bigger than him, and then a man in uniform closing his hand around someone else's life. "How do you know?" she asked. "You said you were at the pier. You said Florence had tapes." Hal produced another object from his jacket, a small reel-to-reel recorder wrapped in damp plastic. She wanted witnesses. She thought if anyone heard it, if a little machine captured those voices, it would ring across the town. She pressed record and we talked. I tried to be practical. I tried to tell her about the danger. We argued. A man we both knew. Someone who was beloved in classrooms and at charitable dinners. Came down with a truck's light in the dark. He said words that were meant to scare us. They fought. He pushed. Lawrence came when he heard the shouting. He never meant to kill her, but he struck. He lunged, and she hit her head on the pier's rail. It was an accident, and then it wasn't. Panic made monsters of people who'd been men. They decided to make it an accident that could belong to anyone. Clara felt the world tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the water. The story, if that was what this was, had the slant and shadow of truth. Fear cover up a protective ring. It was a story every small town guarded against with its social rituals. If true, it meant everything the city revered had been complicit. But Susan, she began and then stopped. Her mind had filled names to test them. She wasn't sure who exactly fit the picture. She knew how the town tilted toward philanthropy, how donors blurred into trustees, how the college's gift lists read like genealogy. Hal's hand trembled as he handed the reel to her. "Listen," he said. "It's not a neat confession. It's not the tidy little story you want. But listen, hear her voice. Hear what's left." Clara threaded the tape into the recorder. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The machine whirred and clicked. And then Florence's voice, clearer and older than the photograph, warmer, human. filled the pier and the rain. And you think if I put their names in the paper, they'll... The tape began. Florence laughed softly. No, they'll deny. They'll pay. But it will be there. And if it's there, someone will have to answer. A man's voice answered. Two men. The murmur of a third. One was clipped, declarative. A voice Clara recognized from decades of public praise. You don't understand, Flo. We'll be ruined. The college will our work. Is worth more than their lives? Florence's voice cut. You're wrong. This is not about the college. It's about them. Another voice, lower urgent. Get her quiet, Hal. She'll ruin us. Hal's own breathing cracked the tape. A faint cough, a clink of metal. Clara's fingers found a recorder as if to steady it. The tape went on, snatches of argument, a chair scraping, Florence's voice breaking. Then a sound she had never heard and wanted not to hear. A heavy thud against wood. A wet smallness like breath stopping. She stilled. The tape's noise inside her like a hand closing. Hal looked at her with eyes that had always been the eyes of the guilty. They thought a tape would be proof, he said. They thought if they could silence Florence and the tape, all could be restored. But she was too stubborn. She gave me the tape, and she begged me to keep it. She told me one day someone would hear her, and if they were brave, they'd open the doors. Clara's mouth tasted of metal. Evidence in her lap, confession on the pier, a son's name dangling like an accusation. This was what law looked like when it bled into family. She thought of Walter's quiet face in the dock at his trial. The way the jury had looked like ordinary citizens asked to decide extraordinary things. She thought of Helen's hands folded like prayers. Why frame Walter, she asked at last. Hal's shoulders humped. Because Walter was easy to fit. He had gaps in his life. He was a man who didn't belong anywhere and could be made to look like he did. They picked him because no one would notice if they hit the edges of his life hard enough to bend him into truth. I planted a cigarette, but I saw it on the bench, and I thought no one would check. Then the forensic techs liked the match. It was science, but it was my lie. He shook his head. I thought at the time I was saving something bigger. I was saving my son. I was keeping roofs over 100 houses, giving them speeches. I told myself I was protecting them from chaos. But in protecting them, I killed a woman, and then another man, an innocent one, had to take that death into his life. The mathematics of guilt are not kind. They compound. The tape whirred to silence as the wind pushed rain into the gaps between their words. Clara's hands were suddenly certain. She had a confession, a voice, and a name. She had the flimsy human thing that might append a community. The truth offered with cracks. Why tell me, she asked. Why not just confess to the DA? Why not go the paper? Hal's face was winded. The DA is bought by those men. The paper sleeps with them. I told myself I'd go to the press in the past. I did once, before I had children, before Lawrence graduated. They chewed me up, so I learned the way of quiet. I kept the tape to myself, like a penitent keeps a rosary. Now I'm going to die with the thing tearing at me. I need someone who isn't their son, someone who isn't beholden, someone who still believes the law means something. Clara thought of the DA, of orange ties and even-handed smiles, and of the way the college had placed comfortable people in positions of power. She thought of the tape humming in her hand like a small bomb. If she took it to court and the DA refused, what then? If she released it to the press, would it be printed and buried beneath op-eds? Or would it explode like sunlight through glass, shattering reputations and changing the city forever? Why not go to public, she said, if what you say is true? Because the public loves the institution. Hal interrupted sharply, and for the first time a fierceness creased his voice. They will protect the name because the name keeps their children fed. They go to dinners and applaud the men who give the college a building. The truth is messy. The truth costs. I don't want my son to be hunted, but I can't carry it any longer. He looked at Clara with something that nearly broke him. I want someone to have a choice to act without my fingers on them. I'm giving you the tape and a list of names. Do with them what you will. But know this, when you pull the string, the whole sweater might come with it. Clara imagined pulling that string. She imagined a town shuddering into memory and returning, furious, to protect itself. She imagined Helen and Arthur, the boy who had become Walter's friend, a room full of people who had set out to teach and found themselves embroiled in the lineaments of evil. She imagined Lawrence Brenner's face, a badge, a life of service, and now the possibility of monstrous culpability. Hal's voice softened. I wish there were clean justice, something the court could make right. The law is a blunt instrument. What it can do is bring facts to light. The court may convict, or it may fold like it always does. So you'll have to choose. Behind them the city breathed. On the pier, the rain rubbed the scene smooth. Clara put the tape back in its case with the mechanical care of someone who had watched too many people fall apart and still hoped to save one thing. I'll do my job, she said. He smiled without humor. Do it, detective. Do it before I'm dead. So you have a man to answer for what he knew. Talk to Helen. Talk to Arthur. Tell them the truth before they die with secrets. Give them the option to forgive or to ask for more. He let out a laugh that was almost a sob. I can't ask for forgiveness, but perhaps you'll get the town to ask, instead of pretending it never needed to. They walked back from the pier as if stepping out of a different country. The harbor swallowed their footprints. Hal left without further farewell, turning back only once to look at the water as if memorizing its rhythm. Clara felt like a person who had been handed a live coal. The next day, the DA's office was a room where leather chairs creaked and sunlight flattened the corners. Clara took the tape to the prosecutor she trusted most, a woman named Dana who had once worked cold cases because she believed in late-arriving truths. Clara watched Dana listen, then watched as the small motions of bureaucracy began. Dana called the lab. She asked for chain of custody. She requested an independent analysis. The DA, Mayor Kershaw's law partner, was a man whose face smiled in the yearbook and in the mayor's office. He answered with a practiced calm and a refusal to commit. We need to be sure, he said. Evidence needs to be bulletproof. Clara saw the pattern. The town's gears grinding into the same place they had 27 years ago. They issued a statement. The DA would review all credible evidence. It was a sentence whose purpose was delay. In the public square, op-eds bloomed into arguments. Columnists asked whether reopening wounds would help anyone. Alumni wrote letters about the college's long service to their children. A donor called the mayor. A building fund was referenced in conversation like an offering. Helen and Arthur were fragile as china, but furious in their way. Helen, who had practiced the slow grief of 27 years, held the tape to her chest and cried a sound without language. If this is true, Arthur said, his jaw working, then we've been standing at a funeral without knowing the name. The community waited as if in a pause between two heartbeats. Then the pause became a choice. The college's board gathered. It was not a secret that some on the board were the people named in Florence's lists, names I had not yet released, and some are not. They decided quietly and then publicly to cooperate. They released a statement expressing profound sorrow for past failures while simultaneously initiating an independent review by a firm picked by the college. The word independent had the same brutal promise in it as Band-Aids on compound fractures. When Clara pressed for arrests, the DA said the evidence needed corroboration, witnesses, documents, a chain not easily severed by attorneys. The tape was real. The voices were theirs. But the men in the recordings were older and had friends in high places. By the time the DA's office got petitions and demands, lawyers arrived with retainer checks and calls to influential trustees. Hushed meetings replaced open hearings. The city responded the way cities often do, with a calculus of risk. For many, a scandal would cost scholarships and programs. For some, the idea of a messy trial that might upend young lives made them recoil. Public opinion fractured along lines of comfort and fear. Meetings were held where the phrase institutional stability was invoked like a prayer. Hal, who had expected thunder, began to wither under the weight of expectation. He sat in his small house and smoked cigarettes until his fingers trembled. He called Clara 3 times in as many days, each time apologizing like a man rehearsing a long script. The tape was played in private rooms and in a television studio in a segment that asked, "Do we want to know?" Viewership spiked. So did the college's donors, offering support for students in language that felt like silk applied to a wound. Then the thing that breaks people happened. Walter Quinn, on the prison feed, serving a life sentence for Florence's murder, was found dead in his cell. The official explanation was that he had hanged himself. It looked too neat. There was an autopsy, and there were suspicious gaps in supervision, and there were officers who had been instructed to take minimal action. The town mourned the man they had once condemned and then doomed. For Helen, it felt like the last of the small kindnesses had been taken away. For some, the timing rang like a bell, tolling the end of any hope for justice. Clara, who had done everything within the frame of law, felt the floor fall out. The DA, whose office had promised careful review, announced no immediate charges. The tape was deemed inconclusive as to criminal identification. The prosecutors said the voices could not be tied to individuals without corroboration beyond a reasonable doubt. It was legal truth being offered as an explanation, but to those who had listened to Florence's voice describe the men who used her, it sounded like betrayal. Hal heard of Walter's death and left the hospital where he'd been sitting with a nurse who cared for him out of clean habit. He walked to the river and sat on the same pier where he had confessed, the rain making little small maps across his cheeks. He called his son Lawrence and left a message that shook with the tenderness only a parent can fake. Then he took off his jacket and walked into the cold water until the river took him like a debt paid late. The town read of Hal's death the way towns read tragedy. Interviews, a sense of sorrow, a retrospective asking how it had been possible. Lawrence Brenner gave a statement with a face that had learned to be untroubled in the light of cameras. He expressed grief and shock, and the abiding belief that the law would do its work. He did not return to the city to speak with Clara. In the days after Hal's death, the piece of paper with names that he had given Clara vanished from her locker at the precinct. The tape, one copy of many, was seized during a court order requested by the DA to maintain the integrity of the investigation. The DA promised transparency, and the investigation receded into the piles of legal motions and delayed hearings. The town learned to sleep again on a bed of questions. Some people left dazes and notes at the reading room. Some people said that justice had been served because someone was in prison, and that was enough. Some people who had felt the cold of a hidden network finally acknowledged the price of their comfort and resented the revelation. But mostly, life contracted back into its habits. Lectures, donor dinners, the smell of roasted coffee in the morning, the small polite exchanges that keep reputations afloat. Clara kept the photograph and the memory of Florence's voice in a small envelope in her desk. She had done everything she knew how to do. She had listened, she had kept the tape safe, she had pushed the DA. She had watched as men with power closed ranks. As months slipped into a year, there were legal inquiries and quiet settlements, and the college promised reforms that read like a language of exile. The final, quiet cruelty revealed itself in the small things. Helen and Arthur accepted a private letter from the college's board offering closure assistance, a euphemism for money and polite words, and a plea to let the past be a lesson, not a spectacle. They went to the reading room and sat on the bench together, their hands folded the way the years had taught them. They understood, in a way that had no recourse, that the town had made a decision. Esteem and continuity would outweigh the full airing of truth. They had been offered something the town could live with instead of the thing their hearts wanted. On the anniversary of Florence's death, Clara went to the reading room alone. She placed the photograph of Florence on the plaque and set a daisy beside it. She thought of Hal's confession, of Walter's cell, of the way a father could choose a son over a stranger. She thought of the tape in the DA's evidence room, of the missing list of names, of Hal and the river. The city moved on with the efficient machinery of people who needed to have breakfasts and meetings and to send children to school. That night she walked past the college's illuminated stone, the trustees' names chiseled into its face and lit like scripture. She saw the donors inside, their silhouettes measured and steady in the ballroom. She thought of Florence and of the students she taught, the ones who had loved her for teaching them the language of being a person. And she thought of how many of them would never see justice in the way the law might claim it. Their truths had been trapped under layers of kindness and investment and fear. Clara pressed her palm against the cool stone of the memorial and whispered the last question she had for the city. Who does a town keep alive? And who does it let die for the sake of its own reflection? The stone gave nothing back. The river moved, indifferent and inevitable. The community, in the end, chose to keep the things that made it comfortable. Its benefactors, its reputation, its charities. It paid for those comforts with the small, quiet death of truth. The crime remained solved in pieces and unresolved in heart. Some names had been named in private letters and late-night confessions that would never see the light of day. Some defendants remained uncharged, and others, like Walter, were gone without the vindication that might have mended a wound. The last paragraph in the papers was small, buried, a paragraph about a memorial scholarship in Florence's name funded by anonymous donors. It was a careful, almost consoling thing. Helen and Arthur sat with one another and read it, and Helen folded the clipping and placed it in an envelope, and then in a drawer where, for the first time since her daughter died, she let sleep come without a dream. Clara stood by the harbor a final time and watched the city lights blink with their familiar, stubborn glow. She had learned the water had more patience than any courtroom. It kept secrets for a long time, rolled them into its dark, and sometimes, when the tide was low and the night was thin, it disclosed only what it wished. She slipped Florence's photograph back into her pocket and walked away. Behind her, Pier 7 hummed like a place that had let someone pass through it and had kept the sound. The town would talk for a while, as towns do when they have been frightened awake. But the pattern of comfort would reassert itself. Small reforms, measured apologies, an award here and there. The men who had been named in Hal's dying breath would keep their public faces, and the ones who had been named in whispers would keep their lives. On the night when Clara finally let the city's lights blur into one long strip of orange, she imagined Florence arranging her pencils by height on a desk somewhere that no one could look into any longer. She thought of the students who still read her essays aloud, and of Hal walking into a river because he could not live with the arithmetic of his choices. She thought of Walter in his cell and of Helen and Arthur, and of the way truth, when it meets the machinery of a town, is often folded into a shape someone else can carry. And for a long time after, when she closed her eyes She heard Florence's voice on a tape she had once held, a voice that said the names and insisted on them, a voice that would not entirely be reduced to silence. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was there, a small thing that someone had left behind, like a stubborn daisy refusing to stop blooming in the thin light of a town that had decided to keep its face. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you stay updated with mystery cold cases. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from.